Right, so hopefully this is going to be a short video about how your EQ and mixdown relates to the game of Tetris and why it's similar. So when we come to making audio tracks, the mixdown or the end result is essentially how all of your sounds sound mashed together. So there's obviously more than one element to a song when you write it, and then when you actually bring that out, the mixdown is essentially the terminology for how prominent or how present your sounds are. So essentially how loud they are in the mix. Now, when it comes to doing a mixdown with simple audio channels, there are 4 planes of movement that we can use. So the obvious one is the volume up and volume down. Now, what you'll notice with a game of Tetris is if you let all of your sounds or all of your pieces in your Tetris game stack one on top of the other all the way down the middle, what happens is you very, very quickly run out of room, and then all of a sudden it's game over. Now, we don't want that when it comes to making an audio track. If everything's playing down through the middle, essentially you run out of headroom, which is the space at the top of your mix when it comes to mastering, and you start to get weird distortions and stuff starts not coming through how you want it, and it just starts to sound like a wall of noise. So what you can do to combat this is you can turn things down. Okay, so that's our first plane, or 2 planes, which is volume up and down. Okay, and the other 2 planes that we have, so the 4 planes of movement we have with the audio as it is panning. So we've got left and right. So there's volume down and up and left and right to get your mix to sound more clear and to give everything its own space. Now, again, how this relates to Tetris, if you just left everything stacking on top of one another, very quickly it would be game over. So what we do is we naturally move the pieces from side to side to try and get them to space out and clear some extra lines to give us some more headroom, some more space at the top of our mix, at the top of our game. So the other thing that I've done is I've added a couple of little lines here. So this amber one we're just going to say is -6 decibels, for example, and then the red one is going to be 0 decibels. So anything over 0 is noise, essentially. That's going to be distorted and not processed correctly by your audio engine or audio interface because it doesn't know what to do with it. Okay. And then anything below 0 is going to be in green because that's not going to be overloading whatever it is that you're doing. Okay, so that's a very, very quick, very basic explanation as to what I'm going to be talking about in this. Now, it's a good point to say that I'm not an expert. This is not what I do for a living, but there is no substitute for experience, and I've done an awful lot of this. And it's just some things that I've helped myself with, essentially, and other people that I know when it comes to doing mixdowns. Okay, so what we're going to do is I've set up a bass drum kit, if you like, to show really my method and what that's all doing. Now, the chap that asked for this, Ollie, has got Cubase, and I know he's got Contact, so I've done this in Cubase and in Contact. So when we go into here, we'll be able to see all of the drums in my drum kit are all in Contact, so all coming through the same instance of Contact. And apart from the clap and the snare, each of these instruments has its own MIDI channel, so from 1 to 6. And the reason I've got the clap and the snare both on MIDI channel 2 is I'm going to have them as a clap snare here. So this is MIDI channel 2, and it's going to be playing both these samples at the same time. So to give you a clue as to how this sounds, we've got this so far. Okay, very, very basic, happy hardcore drum kit, and these samples have all come from a Dougal and Gamma sample disc that I got from Dougal and Gamma, and then I've added a cowbell, because everyone likes a cowbell, and a tambourine from Vengeance Club Sounds Volume 1. Okay, very, very simple stuff. Okay, now what you'll find is that you've got sounds that are playing in a similar frequency range. Okay, so if we go back to our mix console, I've got a copy of Filter open here so that you can see what's coming through the mix. Okay, and when it comes to these sounds, to try and give yourself space in the mix, so going back to our Tetris reference, so things like hi-hats and claps and snares are all sort of playing in about an 8 kilohertz part on the scale. So we say this is the bottom of the scale and this is the top end of the scale, and human hearing goes from 20 to 20,000 hertz, 20 kilohertz. Most cymbals and snare noises are around the 8 kilohertz mark. So when you play all of these together in your mix and your drum kit, they very, very quickly stack on top of one another and go straight out through the roof, and you run out of headroom. So what we can do is we can turn things up and down. So we can drop all of these down. Now, this is a mix down technique in itself, but it is a little bit pie in the sky. So what tends to happen is people set their kick drum at -6 decibels, and then they set the rest of their drums against the kick, because the kick needs to be the most prominent thing in a piece of dance music. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have just the kick and the hi-hat to begin with. Okay, and the kick I'm going to have just playing mono straight down the middle of the mix, and then we're going to have some different elements that are going to be playing at the same time. So normally what I do when I come to do this is I'll have my clap snare and my hi-hat playing at the same time. Okay, so we've used our volume plane, our volume up and down. Now, again, at the moment, these are all playing right down the middle of the mix. Okay, and what we can do to combat that is we can give things its own space. So what some people do is you can find your clap and your snare for your clap snare, and they pan them left and right. So you get the extra width of this particular sound. So I'm just going to overdo this a minute so that you can actually hear the difference. Okay, but the simple thing to do would be to put your clap and snare for your clap snare down one side. Again, I'm overdoing this. All right, so we could put it all the way just to show what I mean. Okay, and then if we put the hi-hat, the offbeat hi-hat, the other way, so what you can do is you can create that space. Now, in all club systems that I've experienced, they play in mono. There's no left and right hand side of a nightclub. There's just mono. So when people are walking about, they don't lose the music. So if you overdo this too much, you're going to lose your sound altogether. And that's why stereo enhancing tools and plugins can be a bit of a misdemeanor, because they'll sound absolutely great in your home studio and through your headphones, and then you go and play it in a nightclub and it'll just disappear. There'll be nothing like you experienced there. But what we can do is we can use a bit of panning to space out the mix. So we can pan our clap snare to the left and our offbeat hi-hat to the right. So you get this pulsing. Okay, now the other thing that we can do is we've got some sounds that are playing at a similar kind of range. So the ride I'm going to leave down the middle because that's playing at the same time as the kick, and we'll leave that just there. But the tambourine, for example, let's bring the tambourine in. Maybe what we could do is we could pan that with the offbeat hi-hat and then the ride that's playing actually on the beat and then the offbeat over here. Okay, so what we've done is we've used our volume up and down for each of these channels to try and separate our sounds out in the mix so that we've got a nice balanced drum kit. But equally, we've used our left and right panning to try and give sounds of the same frequency range a bit of space so that they're not all clashing and getting in each other's way. Now, that might be the sound that you're going for. There's nothing wrong with that. But you might find that you spend an awful lot of time doing a lot of processing to try and get sounds to fit into your mix, when actually it probably wasn't the right sound at all. So sometimes it's easier just to go, do you know what, that sound doesn't fit my mix, scrap it and get something else. Or design your own. Totally different ball game when you get to that stage. Okay. Now with this one, I want my cowbell just to come straight down the middle. Okay, and I want that to be fairly prominent in the mix. And again, when it comes to these things, what you can do is you can do them as a bit of pie in the sky, as in set your kick drum to a volume and then go and pick up everything else around it. Or you can use a new technique that I've experienced recently, or new to me recently, which was DJ UFO, and you use the pink noise to set the volumes of all of your channels so that you get a mix there or thereabouts, and then you move it around from there. So I'll leave a link to UFO's playlist for production tutorials in the comments, okay, or in the description. And essentially, that is why your mixdown should be like a game of Tetris. Now, the other thing that we can use, so if we just use up and down and left and right, we're still going to get pieces that stack on top of one another. But what we can do is we can do like this little blue dude here, is we can hook things in underneath one another to try and create a bit more space, or try and link similar things together without clashing. Now to do that, what we can do is we can use EQ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you very quickly what I mean. Let's drop all these other items out, because the snare drum is the one that most prominently I noticed with this drum kit. So if we have a look over here on filter, where we can actually see this sound coming through, I'm going to do the actual filter cut in Contact, but I'm just going to show you what I am going to do and how I'm going to achieve it just by looking at filter, because it's much easier to see the sound coming through. And what you can do is you can set everything up on its own separate channel, and then you can add one of these to each channel, but essentially you're going to end up doing processing for processing's sake, and I'll explain why in a second. So with a snare drum, as the drum hits the skin of the drum and then rattles the springs on the back of the drum, you still get that definitive moment where the stick strikes the skin. Okay, and that's what this bit down the very bottom end is doing. Yeah, and then you've got the hiss of the snare drum. The springs on the back of the skin of the drum is up at like 4,000 to 8,000 hertz here. Okay, now what we can do is we can do a high pass filter with a very steep shelf. So essentially, the higher the numbers, the steeper the shelf. So there's 12, 24, 48, and 96, for example, just so that you can see what I mean. Okay, and then if we just play the sound, now what you can do, or can risk doing, is getting a bit overzealous with this, and then you lose the prominence of the sound that you put in the first place. Okay. So it's still playing your snare sample, but you've lost half of it. So you still want to get that key element in your track, but you probably don't want the stuff that gets into the bottom end, which is where your kick drum will be. So I'll show you that in a moment. So that's probably where I want it. I want it about there. So cutting off at about 125 hertz, so that I can actually still hear the guts of the sample, if you like, but without any of that noise at the bottom end. So I'm just going to add a high pass filter to this. I'll just do a simple one here. Okay, and then I'm going to adjust this until it essentially starts affecting the sample, so that I know that it's in a similar place to this. Okay, so we're just getting a bit there where it's just starting to tail off and affect the noise. Now, if I bring this all the way down so that it's not affecting the whole drum kit, because that would just be silly, and if I bypass this, okay, what we'll do is we'll turn on the kick drum so that you can see what I mean. So your kick drum is playing all down in this bottom end, but so is the snare drum hit, and that's what we're trying to avoid, is these sounds clashing, stacking up on top of one another and affecting the headroom in your mix unnecessarily. So if we turn this back on, okay, so we lose all of this stuff at the bottom end here because we don't need it. Okay, and that helps separate out your mix. And we can do the same with the clap as well. So here you can actually see that the clap's actually only very slightly playing at this 1 kilohertz range. So if we have like a high pass filter, okay, so we probably want it about there. And for example, if we adjust the volume, so it's minus 25, just so you can see it coming through. Again, when your hands clap together, there's still that instance of the two materials striking one another, even though it's just the palms of your hand. So there's this hit part at 250 hertz that perhaps is going to maybe get in the way of your kick drum, but you don't need any of this stuff at the bottom end. So you can do that quite happily, and what it does is it cuts off any noise that might be coming through with that sample, and then we can do the same here as well. So we want a high pass filter. Okay, and that's essentially what I meant about using the EQ to get items that play in the same frequency range to slide in and out of one another. So for example, we've got our kick drum that's playing all in this bottom end, and we had a bit of snare drum that was sort of hiding in here, if you like, as not very prominent in the mix. But then what we've done is we've EQ'd it so that we can kind of hook it in underneath another piece down here. Now, we've obviously turned this way up, so we want to turn it back down again. So it was about there, wasn't it? And we can put this back into the mix now, so we can have the whole mix together. In fact, before I do that, I'm just going to show you another instance. So let's do it with this. In fact, let's turn all the other bits off. Let's turn all of this off. And then just solo to the ride. So if we turn this right up so it's a bit more prominent on the scale, look. There's nothing playing for this sample all the way up to 3 kilohertz, sorry, I should say. Do we need to put this shelf in here if we already know there's nothing coming through? No. You're just processing for the sake of processing. When you've got good professional quality samples that are already EQ'd, processed, compressed, essentially all of that work's been done for you when it is at the creation of the sample stage. So by the time you get to use it, you probably don't need to do any of that. So sometimes people like to edit them just, because they want to get a certain sound to fit in a certain place. So they might find that this particular ride sample they want to get it to pitch at a particular point. So you can essentially let's stick that there and a bit of resonance on it, so you get a bit of a. So some people might want to achieve that sound, and then they might want to bring this all the way up so that you only get a very small amount of it. Some people are trying to achieve that when they want to get really specific and unique drums. But for this, I just want a ride cymbal. I don't need it to do anything like that. That's what I want. So if we bring that back down to 0 and unmute it, we can bring it back into the mix. Okay, and that's essentially what I want with my drum kit. Now, what else do we want? Well, it's a hardcore track. So the thing to do is to create a bass. Okay, now what I'm going to do, I've already got the notes here that I want, but I'm just going to create a very simple bass patch so that you can see, that you can do it yourself just as easily as getting a sample to do it. Now, I'm going to do this with Retrolog because I know that Ollie has got Retrolog because he's got Cubase. So we're just going to go with a very, very simple Retrolog patch. Okay. Okay. Very, very simple. I'm going to set the phase to fixed. Okay. Or in fact, no, I'm going to leave that as free so you can actually see what I mean. Okay. Let's have a free phase. And then I'm going to turn the sub on. Now, the sub on this one, I think I'm going to leave as a triangle. Okay. This has a phase control on it as well. If I move this down an octave, okay, let's just try making this a square, shall we? Okay, and then this one we'll say is going to be a sawtooth wave as well. Okay, so we've got a pretty meaty bass going on in here, but I don't want any movement in the sound. I want this to be as clear as day with no movement. Some people want that movement in it. I want it just stay exactly the same, so it's consistent for every note right the way throughout the mix. Okay, so this is coming through really loud. So essentially we need to turn it down. There's our first sort of plane of control. We can actually turn the volume down. Okay. The other thing with bass is you do sometimes get a bit of top end on it because we're using a bit of sawtooth and we're using a bit of square. If you want it to be bass, let's keep it as bass. Okay, just take that little bit of top end off using the cutoff, or maybe using filter as a filter, or another type of filter that you have. Okay, so we also know that that's not going to get in the way of the rest of the mix that we've got. Okay, and because we're using MIDI, if we want to change these notes for whatever reason, if I can find them, there we go, we can actually go to the MIDI editor and actually bring these down to a different. Okay, you'll also notice that these that I've put in beforehand are not an entire half note. So if we make it a half beat. Okay, you can also sharpen that right up so it's only a quarter of a beat on the off beat. Alright, so that's kind of the difference that that is making. So I'm just going to leave it on how I had it to begin with, because I want to hear it, but I want that element of silence before it gets to the next kick drum, so there's a much more definitive movement there. So again, if this was stuff not necessarily kick and bass, if this was another type of noise, what I could do, because they're playing down the same frequency area in the mix, is I could pan these left and right, and then they wouldn't be getting in each other's way so much. All right, but for kick and bass, that's the one thing that drives an entire track. So that's the one thing that someone should be able to dance to without anything else playing. And a DJ that I once knew said, if you can't dance to the kick and bass on its own, you've probably gone wrong somewhere and you need to start again. And that'll be that the sampled kick you've got doesn't match the bass as well as you'd like it, or the bass that you've created is perhaps better suited to another song. So that's got me nodding my head a bit, so I think that's probably a good place to start. Now, the other thing that is kind of popular in modern hardcore is to have a little arpeggio running. So I've created some notes here, and all I've done is I've stepped the volumes of these. So the most prominent one is the one actually on the off beat. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a very, very simple patch. And for this, I'm going to use V Station because I'm old and I like it. Okay. Now let's link that to V Station and let's put that on a totally blank patch. Okay, so I've put a bit of variation in those notes just so that you can actually hear it. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to solo this so that I can hear it. Drop it down an octave. Let's have the bass in as well. And do you know what? Let's add a square in both ways. Let's stick this all on the same octave. Okay, and we'll detune this one 12 semitones down and this one 12 semitones up. Okay, so we've got that kind of key noise going through it. And what we'll do is we'll just drop a bit of the cutoff off, so the top end just off a little bit, because we still want it to be a bassy noise. It's a bass arpeggiator for that purpose. And if we were writing some trance, there'd definitely be a bit of delay on it, so we'll just go for this one while we're here. Okay, so probably bring the time down and the feedback down a little. Okay, and again, if it was trance, we'd probably have some reverb on it. Okay, now you want to be careful with reverb, because the more reverb you add to something, the less prominence a sound will have in the mix. Okay, and what it does is it hides in the background. So sometimes when you want to hear something tail a bit more, it might be better to adjust or add some delay rather than reverb. But again, if it's right, you don't need to add effects and processing for the sake of it. Okay. Right, so I want to just change this for a bit of EQ, or rather filter. So I'm going to add the filter plugin to this channel, because I want the bass to be in the bass range. I want my bass arp to not be there. So I want to try and bring that bottom end up so that it's not getting in the way of the bass. We've got all this stuff down here. All right, and then when we come to like adding lead noises to this track and whatnot, I probably don't want this arp to get in the way of that either. So I'm going to bring this down as well. Okay, so we've just got this playing in here, and I'll probably just want to bring the volume down. So we'll just try it doing in the reverse. So we'll bring the kick back in. Okay, and then we'll bring the rest of our drum kit back in. Before you know it, you've started writing some hardcore. Okay, so back to the original topic. That's essentially why your mixdown and EQs are like a game of Tetris, because if all of your sounds stack up through the center or stack up through any part of your mix, you'll run out of headroom very quickly, and that'll be game over. So what we do is we can adjust the volume of things to show how prominent or not they will be in your mix. And we can pan them left and right to try and give them their own space. And what we can also do is we can perhaps EQ sounds to cut off part of it so that it doesn't get in the way of something that's already there. But the crucial thing with that is you cannot polish a turd. So if you're doing lots and lots of processing on a sound, it's probably not the right sound, and maybe you should look for another one. And I guess the only other thing to do is to listen to this some more. There you go. That's it. Cheers.